The head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard says that Saturday will be the last day that protesters could take to the streets without consequences. There have been sustained anti-government protests in Iran for weeks now, with one person shot and killed in the city of Zahedan on Friday.
The warning by Revolutionary Guard Commander-in-Chief, Major General Hussein Salami, has raised concerns about a possible ramping up of a crackdown on unrest across Iran. Protests erupted across the country following the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini while in custody of the morality police last month. These demonstrations represented some of the boldest criticisms of clerical leadership since the 1979 revolution. Iranian citizens have ignored previous warnings and continued with protest, many of which had women playing leading roles. Some protests have turned deadly, however, with reports of at least 250 protesters killed and thousands arrested across Iran. The Revolutionary Guard has not been deployed during these protests, but they remain feared as an elite force notorious for crushing dissent.
To get some reaction and perhaps some latest developments, we're now joined by Sussan Tahmasebi, who's director of FEMENA, which is an organization that supports women and human rights defenders and feminist movements in the broader Middle East and North Africa region. Thanks so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
You must be watching with concern what's happening inside Iran. What have you heard in terms of latest developments there, especially given this threat that's been given by the chief of the commander-in-chief of the guards?
Well, it's a ridiculous threat because it's not as if it hasn't been bloody already. We've witnessed 3 consecutive extremely bloody and violent days in Iran. 3 days ago was the 40th day after the death of Mahsa Amini, where her family was threatened so that they don't hold a ceremony for her, and roadblocks were created so people don't go to the ceremony, but people showed up in droves. They crossed rivers and mountains and walked because they couldn't drive there to the ceremony, and it was a huge turnout that was extremely violent, and people were killed at that gathering. The next day was the 40th day of after the death of Nika Shah-Karami, a 16-year-old girl who was killed in protests. So high school kids are getting killed, and kids are getting killed in large numbers in Iran. And people were also met with extreme violence and killed. And then yesterday was during Friday prayers in Zahedan, again, because people were objecting to almost 100 people killed in the previous Friday prayers. That was also met with extreme violence. And we have reports of 3 children, the last that I heard, 3 children, 14, 16, 2 of them that have been identified, 14 and 16-year-olds that were killed along with other people. It was extremely violent. And then today we have stories of guards and security forces attacking students in their dormitories in various cities. Right now, Tehran, but also Urumiyeh, Ahvaz. Very disturbing footage of kids being dragged across the floor violently in Ahvaz dormitory, and people who are being suspected of protesting are being targeted. So it's not even that people are actually protesting, people who are being suspected, which has been the norm since the start of these protests. Even the head of the judiciary said that we're going to have to address this preemptively. So scores of human rights defenders, human rights activists, women's rights activists, journalists have been arrested since the start of these protests because they're suspected that they could potentially play a role in the protests. So it's not even that they're even playing a role, but because they're known human rights defenders, they're being arrested. And now they're doing the same thing across the country very violently in university settings. And just imagine sending your kids to university. They're in a dormitory. Most of these kids in dormitories don't have family members. They have nowhere to go in those cities to hide. So they're like sitting ducks. They're a very easy prey. And that's what the security forces are doing to create fear among Iranians. And it's hideous, the level of violence that they have been using.
Many would say that this current wave of clampdowns by authorities was sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini, but I wonder if her death in custody was more a catalyst for issues that had been bubbling under for some time.
Well, certainly, I think initially the protests were, organized asking for justice for Mahsa, because killing with impunity has become a regular thing in the, judiciary and in prisons of Iran and at the hands of security forces. No one is ever punished or held accountable for killing of innocent citizens. So I think part of it was that. But then also people were angry that she was arrested because of her hijab, which is ridiculous, and then paid with such a high price. So certainly, initially, a big part of these protests were about women's rights and the violence at which women's bodies are controlled and monitored. And that still continues to be a big part of these protests, but still many other demands have been added to the protests. And I think it's very easy. I think we can summarize it by saying, by repeating one of the main chants, which is women, life and freedom. And people are asking for freedom. They want to be able to live their life out, live out their aspirations without all the impediments that the Islamic Republic is imposing upon them. And especially women and young people. We see a lot of young people who have, they belong to Generation Z. They're very much similar to young people, their peers across the world, and their aspirations and demands are similar to their peers across the world, and how they envision their future is very, very different than what the Islamic Republic has to offer them and what it has in store for them. So they're asking for freedom, and that's what we hear. A lot of the chants are saying freedom, freedom, freedom. That's what people want. And so I think that kind of summarizes the demands of what they want.
It does seem that the Iranian authorities are struggling to get a message out there. One hears now, they said that Mahsa Amini died of natural causes, that it had nothing to do with her incarceration. And now we're seeing that two journalists that had first brought the story out about her death being accused of working for the CIA.
Listen, the people of Iran have repeatedly used every single opportunity they've had to express their demands for political and social change. And they've engaged the government. For over 20 years, they've engaged in the reform movement. And the government, the Islamic Republic, refuses to hear that. They refuse to acknowledge that there is a crisis in governance inside of the country and that they're are not willing to respond to the demands of people. So they constantly blame it on foreigners, on foreign powers, on foreign people outside the country. But these are indigenous demands. And these two young journalists did nothing but their job, which was reporting, Nilufar Hamidi and Elahe Mohammadi. And actually their editors have come out and said that they have done nothing wrong and they were working for their papers. And it's ridiculous. It's a farce, really. Everybody knows it, that this is consistently how the Islamic Republic deals with genuine and real demands of its people for basic human rights, that it says that these demands are fabricated by people outside, which is ridiculous, because people just want to have their human rights and they want to have their human rights respected. And unfortunately, this system has refused to do that, has failed to do that consistently for decades now. So, it's a ploy to dismiss the genuine demands of Iranian people.
Are women particularly vulnerable? One gets a sense that perhaps culture and religion may be used as a cover for some of the activity.
Yes, the Iranian women have objected to very strict and conservative interpretation of Sharia law, which, 40 years ago when it was instituted, it was far beyond Iranian culture, behind Iranian culture. And it still continues to be far behind Iranian culture. Iranian women have used every single opportunity to advance themselves. And they used every single opportunity to demand change and to demand equality with no response whatsoever from the Iranian government. Women are 50% of university students, more than 50% graduating are women, so they're more educated than their male counterparts, but their rights are not respected. They're counted as half that of a man. And, Iranian society is far beyond that. They're far beyond these laws. These laws are from 1400 years ago, and Iranian society, as you can see, because we're having a women-centered revolution in Iran. So the Iranian people think very differently than the state. But the state keeps insisting on controlling their bodies, controlling the way they dress, controlling their reproductive health, controlling their position in the family, and forcing them into positions, into roles that clearly does not make sense, not only for women, but for Iranian society.
Your thoughts about the international community's response to this crisis that's playing out in Iran? What more could be happening?
Well, the government of South Africa and the government of Iran have long had good relations. We're asking governments in the global South to really call Iran out on the incredible violence that it's using against peaceful protesters who are unarmed, the majority of whom are young people under 20 or in their 20s, in universities and in high schools, the majority of whom are women. None of them are armed, none of them are using violence. But they're being met with violence and live ammunition. I mean, parts of Iran, really, when you see videos, it looks like war zones. So we really expect the government of South Africa and other global South countries, non-aligned countries, to call Iran out on this level of incredible violence. And, to take measures within the human rights system, to call for better accountability or other accountability mechanisms to follow up on this violence and to hold Iran accountable.
What do you see then coming in this coming week, given this threat that's been given by this commander-in-chief? He said today's the last day. We're not going to put up with it anymore. What does that mean?
It's hard to speculate, because I've known, everybody knows that the Islamic Republic of Iran can use a lot of violence, and it's used a lot of violence. It used a lot of violence to quell protests in 2019. It's used a lot of violence to quell protests in 2017, and it's using a lot of violence now. So I'm sure that they're true to their threat, and they're going to use a lot of violence, as we've seen what's happening in the universities today, these young people who are being attacked in the only place that they have to live and to sleep, they're hiding out in those places. It's horrible. So I have no doubt that they're going to use a lot more violence. They've already used quite a bit of violence. They're going to use a lot more violence. They've used violence even in prisons. So this is where, they go after the people who are the most vulnerable. University students in dormitories, prisoners in prisons, starting fires, using live ammunition against them to kill them. So I don't doubt that they're serious and they're going to use more violence. But I can't speculate on what the Iranian people will do, because there's been a lot of violence from the beginning, and these protests have continued. So I think that protesters are truly sick and tired of the status quo, and they want change. And, I would assume that they're probably going to continue protesting, just as, the dormitories have been attacked, but other students are still protesting. So I can't speculate about what the protesters are going to do, but I'm sure that the Iranian forces are going to use even more violence.
Sussan, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us and sharing your insights with us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me and for paying attention to Iran.
Thank you. All right, that was Sussan Tahmasebi, who's the director of FEMENA, an organization that supports women and human rights defenders and feminist movement in the broader Middle East, speaking to us about the situation in Iran. Protests have continued for weeks. They've been given an ultimatum that today was the last day that the authorities would put up with it. We'll have to wait and see what happens in the next 24 hours.